Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. Today we're doing the third and final part of a 3-part case based on the Moors murders. If you want to hear part 1 and 2, then please go back to episodes 17 and 18. If not, then stick around for part 3. Before we get going, you can find us on all the socials at What They Hide Pod. You can email us, whattheyhidepod@gmail.com. If you want to suggest a show, leave a shout out. You can reach out to us in any of those places. Now we're going to be doing shout outs at the end of the show, so make sure you stick around. And don't forget to like, follow, share and all that jazz so that we grow the show and get more people listening. Alright, let's crack on with the show. This episode contains discussion of violence, abuse and crimes against children. Please take care when listening. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The landscape stretches outward in every direction, uninterrupted by buildings or boundaries. Saddleworth Moor is vast, uneven and exposed, a place shaped over time by weather and isolation. The ground rises and falls in subtle gradients, covered in grass and peat that shifts underfoot. Even in daylight, there is a sense of distance here, as though the land exists slightly removed from everything around it. The wind moves steadily across the surface, carrying with it a constant low presence. There are no structures to interrupt it, no barriers to contain it. It travels across the moor without resistance, reinforcing the stillness that defines the space. To anyone passing through, it appears unchanged, a landscape without obvious distinction, open, quiet, unremarkable, and yet, by the time the investigators turned their attention here, that perception had already begun to shift. Because what had once been considered empty ground was now being viewed differently. Not as scenery, but as a location, a place that might hold answers to questions that had remained unresolved for years. The investigation had already moved beyond a single event. The evidence recovered from the house, the material found within the suitcase, the emerging connections between missing children, all of it pointed towards something larger, something structured, something deliberate, and something that required a place to exist. That place, increasingly, appeared to be the moor. This was not an immediate conclusion. It didn't emerge from a single piece of evidence or a definitive statement. Instead, it developed gradually as investigators examined what they knew and considered what remained unexplained. The pattern suggested repetition. The absence of recovery suggested concealment, and concealment required a location. Saddleworth Moor offered that possibility. Its scale alone presented challenges, miles of open ground, difficult terrain, and a landscape that did not easily reveal disturbance. It was not a place that could be searched quickly or easily. And more importantly, it was not a place that could be understood at a glance. Knowing where to look in general terms was not the same as knowing where to begin. There was no precise location, no marked point, no clear indication of where anything might be found, only an area, broad, undefined, and resistant to certainty. For investigators, this created a new kind of challenge. The search would need to be systematic, carefully planned, executed with patience and precision, because without structure, the scale of the moor would overwhelm the process before it began. Search teams were organised accordingly, resources were allocated, sections of land were identified and divided into manageable areas, each requiring careful examination. The work would be slow, not because of inefficiency, but because of necessity. Every part of the ground had to be considered, every variation in the landscape had to be assessed. There could be no assumption, no reliance on chance, only method. As preparations were completed and teams moved into position, the atmosphere surrounding the search shifted. What had once been speculation was now being tested. What had been suggested through evidence was now being pursued in reality. And with that came an understanding, unspoken but present, that what they might find would confirm the full extent of the case. The search began without certainty, but not without expectation, because although nothing had yet been discovered, the direction was clear, and for the time, Saddleworth Moor was no longer just a possibility. It was the focus. The search moved slowly, not because of hesitation, but because of necessity. Each section of land was examined in sequence, with teams working methodically across the moor. The terrain did not allow for speed. The ground was uneven, in places soft, in others compacted by time and weather. Every step required attention, and every area required consideration. There were no clear indicators, no obvious disturbances, nothing that immediately suggested where attention should be focused, which meant the process relied on detail. Small variations, subtle differences in the landscape that might otherwise be overlooked. As the search continued, those differences became the only points of reference. A change in the surface, a shift in colour, a slight irregularity in the ground. Individually they meant very little, but collectively they guided the search. At one location that pattern shifted. The ground appeared slightly uneven, subtly raised compared to the surrounding area. It was not immediately significant, but it was enough to draw attention, enough to justify a closer examination. Search officers paused. The area was assessed more carefully. The variation was noted, and a decision was made to investigate further. The process that followed was controlled, measured. There was no urgency in the physical sense, only focus. The ground was examined using tools designed to detect differences beneath the surface. Probing rods were used to test the resistance of the soil, inserted carefully into the ground to identify changes in density. At this location, the resistance was not consistent. The soil gave way more easily than expected. That inconsistency confirmed what had only been suspected. The ground had been disturbed. At that point, excavation began, carefully, layer by layer. The process was slow, deliberate, and documented throughout. Each movement of soil was controlled, each change recorded. There could be no damage to what lay beneath. As the excavation progressed, the texture of the ground changed. The soil became looser, less compact, indicating that it had been moved at some point in the past. Then, evidence emerged. At first, it was not immediately clear. A shape, a form within the soil, but as the excavation continued, that form became more defined, more recognisable. until there was no longer any doubt. Human remains. The search had moved from possibility to confirmation. The area was secured. The excavation continued under stricter control, with forensic procedures guiding each step. The remains were carefully uncovered, documented, and prepared for removal. At this stage, identification was not immediate, but there were indicators: clothing, position, details that could be compared against existing records. The remains were transported for examination, and over time, that identification was confirmed. The victim was John Kilbride, 12 years old, missing since November 1963. For investigators, this confirmation was significant. It validated the direction of the search, confirmed the connection between the suspects and the earlier disappearances, and established Saddleworth Moor as a location central to the case. But beyond the investigation, the impact extended further, because for John's family, this was the first answer they had received in nearly 2 years. An answer to what had happened, an end to uncertainty, but not to loss. The search continued, because investigators knew this was not the only location, not the only victim, and what had been found here was only the beginning. The discovery of John Kilbride confirmed what investigators had already begun to expect, that the search of Saddleworth Moor was not exploratory, but necessary. The evidence had pointed in this direction. Now it had been validated, and with that validation came certainty. There would be more. The question was not whether additional victims would be found, but where. The search expanded, not randomly, but in a controlled and deliberate way. Areas were re-evaluated, information was revisited, statements re-examined for details that might previously have seemed insignificant. The process became increasingly focused, because now investigators were no longer working from possibility. They were working from confirmation. The moor was no longer a theory. It was a crime scene. Further areas were identified, sections of land that aligned with the information available, locations that, when mapped against known movements and emerging evidence, required examination. Search teams returned to the terrain, resuming the same process: measured, systematic, patient. Once again, the work was slow. There were no clear markers, no obvious signs, only subtle differences in the ground, variations that required experience to interpret and time to confirm. At another location, attention was drawn to a similar irregularity, a slight disturbance, barely visible, but enough to justify investigation. The same process was followed. The area was assessed, the ground tested, resistance measured, and once again, the soil did not behave as expected. It gave way too easily, indicating prior disturbance. Excavation began, carefully, layer by layer, each movement controlled, each stage documented. The process mirrored what had already taken place, but this time there was less uncertainty, because investigators now knew what they might find. As the ground was removed, evidence began to emerge, gradually, not immediately recognisable, but becoming clearer with each stage of excavation, until, once again, there was confirmation: human remains, the second discovery. The remains were later identified as Leslie Ann Downey, 10 years old, missing since 1964. The identification carried additional weight, because unlike the earlier cases, there had already been indications of what had happened to her, evidence recovered from the investigation, material that had suggested involvement. Now, that suggestion had been confirmed. The connection between Brady and Hindley and multiple victims was no longer in question. It was established. With each discovery, the scale of the case became clearer. This was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern, repeated, structured, carried out over time, and concealed with intent. The search continued, because even with 2 victims recovered, there were still others, names that remained unsolved, cases that had not yet reached conclusion. Among them, Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. Their absence became more pronounced with each discovery, because now there was confirmation that the moor held answers, which meant it might also hold them. Search teams continued to work, expanding the area, revisiting sections, following new lines of information as they emerged. But the terrain remained difficult, the scale remained overwhelming, and despite continued effort, not all victims were located. For investigators, this created a different kind of challenge. The case had been proven, the pattern established, the connection confirmed, but the search remained incomplete. And that incompleteness carried weight, because while some families now had answers, others didn't, and for them, the uncertainty continued. As the search progressed, another phase of the case began to take shape, because alongside the physical evidence, there were statements, interviews, admissions that would begin to clarify the timeline and the full extent of what had taken place. The investigation was no longer focused solely on where. It was beginning to answer how and why. As the search of Saddleworth Moor continued, the focus of the investigation began to shift once again. Not away from the land, but beyond it, toward the people responsible and the sequence of events that had led there. With physical evidence now recovered and the connection between multiple victims established, the investigators returned to the interviews. This time, with greater clarity and a broader understanding of what they were asking. Ian Brady remained composed. His approach to questioning did not change significantly. He was controlled in his responses, measured, deliberate in the way he chose his words. He didn't offer information freely, and when he did speak, it was often within limits he appeared to set himself. But the situation around him had changed. The evidence no longer supported a single explanation. It pointed to a series of events, a pattern that extended over time, and that pattern required clarification. Myra Hindley was also questioned again, separately, under the same scrutiny. Her responses at first remained consistent with what had been previously stated, aligned with Brady's version of events. But as the investigation progressed, and as the scale of the evidence became clearer, that position began to shift. Gradually. Not for a single statement, but for a series of changes. Details began to emerge. Fragments of information, that, when considered together, formed a more complete picture. Investigators worked to establish a timeline, not just of the final incident, but of everything that had preceded it. They examined movements, dates, locations, comparing statements with evidence, testing each account against what had already been confirmed. And as that process continued, the sequence of events began to take shape. The disappearances of Pauline Reed, John Kilbride, Keith Bennett and Leslie Ann Downey were no longer separate cases. They were connected, part of the same pattern, carried out over time, with intent. The investigation also clarified how the victims had been approached, the methods used, the way trust had been established. Not through force at first, but through familiarity, through the appearance of normality, and through the use of a pair rather than an individual. These details were not presented as theory. They were supported by evidence, by statements, by material recovered during the investigation. As the timeline became clearer, so did the scale. This was not a single event repeated without structure. It was organised, planned, each action considered. For investigators, the objective was not only to establish what had happened, but to present it in a way that could be understood fully, documented clearly, and ultimately presented in court. Because the investigation was now moving towards its next stage, the legal process, where the evidence would be examined, the events reconstructed, and responsibility formally established. But even at this stage, there were limitations. Not every question had been answered. Not every victim had been found. The absence of Keith Bennett remained. A gap in the investigation that could not be resolved through evidence alone. And for his family, that absence would continue. Despite that, the case itself had reached a point of clarity. The pattern had been established, the individuals responsible identified, and the sequence of events understood. What remained was to bring that understanding into the public record, through the trial, and through the formal process of justice, because what had been uncovered would now be examined in full, in a way that would define the case and its legacy for years to come. As the investigation concluded, the case moved into the legal system, where the events that had been uncovered would be presented in full. The trial of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley began in April 1966. By this stage, the structure of the case had been established, the evidence gathered, the timeline defined. But the trial brought those details into a public setting, where they would be examined, documented, and understood beyond the investigation itself. The proceedings focused on multiple charges, each relating to the deaths of young victims, each supported by a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and material recovered during the investigation. Among the most significant elements presented were the recordings, audio evidence that confirmed not only involvement, but intent. The effect of this material was profound, not because of how it was described, but because of what it represented. For the jury, the task was clear: to consider the evidence, to establish responsibility, and to determine the outcome. Both Brady and Hindley were found guilty. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. At the time, the expectation of release remained uncertain, but as the years passed, that uncertainty would be removed. The severity of the case led to decisions that ensured neither would be released. Their sentences became whole life terms, reflecting the scale and nature of the crimes. For the families, the verdict provided a form of resolution, but not closure, because while responsibility had been established, not every question had been answered. The search of Saddleworth Moor had led to recovery of victims, but had not located them all. The absence of Keith Bennett remained, and that absence continued to define the case for his family. Years later, in 1987, another search of the moor was carried out, this time following further statements from Hindley. Information that suggested additional locations, additional areas that had not previously been examined in detail. During that search, remains were recovered, later identified as Pauline Reed. Her discovery came more than 2 decades after her disappearance, providing answers that had not been available for years. But like the earlier discoveries, it also reinforced what had already been understood, that the Moor had concealed these crimes for a long time. Despite this, the search for Keith Bennett continued. Repeated efforts were made over the years, areas revisited, information reassessed, but he was never found. For his family, that absence never changed. It remained a question without resolution. As the years passed, Brady and Hindley remained in prison. Their cases continued to attract attention. Applications for release were considered, debated, and ultimately rejected. Myra Hindley died in 2002, still in custody. Her involvement in the case remains central to discussions about responsibility, rehabilitation, and justice. Ian Brady remained in prison for decades. His time in custody included periods in secure psychiatric care, where he was held due to concerns relating to his mental state. He died in 2017, also in custody. With their deaths, the possibility of further clarification diminished, because while some details had been established, others remained uncertain. For the families of the victims, the passage of time did not lessen the impact. Each discovery brought answers, but also renewed attention, renewed awareness of what had been lost. For those still without resolution, the experience was different, because without a final answer, there is no clear ending. Only continuation. The case itself became part of a broader history, one of the most significant criminal investigations in the UK, not only because of what happened, but because of how it unfolded, the way separate cases became connected, the role of a single witness, and the importance of evidence in revealing what had been hidden. Saddleworth Moor remains, unchanged in appearance, the same landscape, the same open ground, but it is no longer viewed in the same way. It carries history, meaning, a connection to events that cannot be separated from it. For those who visit, it may still appear quiet, unremarkable, but that perception exists alongside something else, an understanding of what occurred there, because some places do not change in appearance, but they change in meaning. And Saddleworth Moor is one of them. This case began with disappearances, with uncertainty, with questions that had no immediate answers. It moved through investigation, through discovery, through the gradual uncovering of a pattern, and it ended with understanding, not complete, but defined. Because while not every answer was found, enough was uncovered to reveal the truth. And once revealed, that truth remains. And that's where we're going to leave this series. The Moor's murders is a case that spans years, but its impact extends far beyond that. For the families of the victims, it is not something that exists in the past. It remains present, in memory, in absence, and in the questions that for some still remain unanswered. If you've listened through all 3 parts of this series, thank you so much. These are not easy stories to sit with, and taking the time to understand them matters. Before we finish, I want to give a quick shout out to a few of you who have been listening and supporting the podcast. Liam in Sheffield, Emma from Birmingham, and Josh over in Glasgow. Thank you for your messages and for following along with the series. And to everyone else listening, whether you've just found the podcast or you've been here from the start, it's genuinely appreciated. If you found this series informative or worthwhile, make sure you're following or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have a moment to leave a rating or review, it helps more people find the show, which allows more stories like this to be told. We'll be back soon with another case. But for now, this has been the Moor's Murders on Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.